Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
The shadowy monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt has just released a banned manuscript that predicts a catastrophic siege in the land of ancient Israel, eerily paralleling the chaos unfolding in Gaza today. What I am about to reveal will connect ancient Hebrew prophecy with the shocking ultimatum Israel has given regarding Gaza's complete occupation. This is not just a political crisis. It is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy in real time, and the Hebrew Israelites hold crucial keys to understanding what comes next. In my decades of studying ancient manuscripts, hidden, forgotten libraries across the Middle East, I have never encountered such precise prophetic alignment with modern events. The manuscript, written in ancient Hebrew mixed with Aramaic, describes a time when the children of Israel would face an impossible choice in their homeland, where mercy and justice would collide in ways that echo throughout eternity. Have you ever wondered why Gaza, this tiny strip of land, captures the attention of the entire world? The answer lies buried in biblical prophecy and the scattered wisdom of the Hebrew Israelites who preserved these secrets through millennia of exile. What absolutely stunned me about Israel's latest declaration is how perfectly it aligns with the prophetic warnings found in this ancient text. The all-or-nothing ultimatum demanding the return of every hostage or face total occupation mirrors the language used in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Moses describes the choice between blessing and curse, life and death, that would define Israel's destiny. This moment represents far more than military strategy or political negotiation. We are witnessing the unfolding of end times events that will reshape the Middle East and fulfill ancient prophecies about the regathering of tribes and the final judgment of nations. The St. Catherine manuscript, carbon dated to the 4th centuries, contains marginalia in ancient Hebrew that reference specific geographical markers corresponding to modern Gaza. The anonymous scribe describes visions of a coastal territory where the descendants of Abraham would face their greatest test, where the choice between justice and vengeance would determine the fate of all nations. These prophecies were sealed away for over 16 centuries, only emerging now as we approach what Hebrew chronology indicates are the final years before a great prophetic transition. During my 3-week stay at the monastery, I worked with Coptic scholars and Hebrew linguists to decode passages that had remained illegible for generations. Advanced spectral imaging revealed hidden text describing a time when the Sea Peoples, ancient inhabitants of the Gaza region, would cry out to heaven as their land became a prison. The manuscript warns that this period of suffering would test whether the children of Israel compassion had learned through their own experiences of exile and persecution. The current crisis began when Israeli forces gained control of approximately 75% of Gaza, according to the latest IDF operational reports. Military analysts describe this as the most comprehensive occupation since 1967, with Israeli troops establishing permanent checkpoints and administrative control over key infrastructure. The remaining 25%, concentrated in southern Gaza near Rafah, houses nearly 2 million displaced Palestinians living in conditions that international observers describe as catastrophic. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced the ultimatum during a closed Knesset session, stating that Hamas has until September 15th to release all 53 remaining hostages or face complete territorial occupation. Intelligence sources confirm that this deadline coincides with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, adding religious significance that Hebrew Israelites interpret as prophetically loaded. The timing suggests that Israel views this crisis through eschatological rather than purely military lenses. The hostage situation adds unprecedented complexity to this occupation. 53 Israelis remain in captivity, their families demanding immediate action while simultaneously fearing that military escalation could seal their loved ones' fate. Recent hostage videos show deteriorating physical condition, with medical experts warning that delayed rescue attempts may become recovery missions. The all-or-nothing language reflects the impossibility of partial solutions when human lives hang in the balance. What struck me most profoundly during my recent visits to Hebrew Israelite communities in Jerusalem, Detroit, and Lagos was their interpretation of these events through the lens of biblical exile and restoration narratives. Elders spoke of Gaza's suffering as reflecting the curses described in Deuteronomy, while simultaneously expressing hope that the crisis might precipitate the prophetic awakening of scattered tribes. Their perspective challenges both Israeli and Palestinian nationalist narratives by emphasizing spiritual dimensions often ignored in political analysis. Rabbi Ben Ami, a Hebrew Israelite teacher in Jerusalem's Old City, showed me genealogical charts tracing his community's lineage to the ancient tribe of Judah. He argued that Gaza's crisis fulfills the prophecy in Jeremiah about the restoration of all Jacob's tribes, including those scattered among the nations. His interpretation suggests that current events serve divine purposes beyond human political calculations, preparing the way for prophetic restoration that will vindicate the faithful while judging the nations. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has reached unprecedented levels that fulfill biblical descriptions of siege and famine with terrifying accuracy. United Nations reports document that 93% of children face acute malnutrition, with medical facilities overwhelmed by cases of starvation-related illness. Water systems have collapsed, leaving families dependent on contaminated sources that spread disease throughout overcrowded refugee camps. The situation bears haunting resemblance to the siege of Jerusalem described in 2 Kings, where mothers were reduced to unthinkable acts of desperation. Dr. Sarah Lyer, a pediatrician working in Gaza's remaining hospitals, described scenes that echo biblical accounts of siege conditions. Children arrive daily suffering from kwashiorkor and marasmus, diseases of severe malnutrition rarely seen outside disaster zones. Her reports document cases of families sharing single meals among 8 or 10 members, with parents skipping food entirely to keep children alive. These conditions mirror the curses described in Deuteronomy 28, where siege would reduce people to eating their children. Recent hostage videos released by Hamas captives displaying visible signs of malnutrition and psychological distress, intensifying pressure on Israeli leadership to act decisively. Families of the hostages describe an impossible situation where delay might mean death from deteriorating conditions. Yet military action could result in their immediate execution. This cruel dilemma epitomizes the prophetic choice between life and death that Moses presented to the Israelites in the wilderness. International aid organizations struggle to deliver assistance through Israeli-controlled checkpoints, creating bottlenecks that exacerbate the crisis. The World Food Programme reports that convoys wait days for security clearance, while children die from preventable causes. These delays reflect the broader breakdown of humanitarian systems that occurs when political objectives override human need, a pattern repeated throughout biblical history when nations prioritized power over compassion. The blockade has created what economists describe as a controlled economic collapse, with Gaza's GDP shrinking by 85% since October. Unemployment approaches 100% as most economic activity has ceased. The few functioning businesses operate on barter systems, with residents trading personal possessions for basic necessities. This economic devastation fulfills prophetic warnings about cities under siege, where silver and gold become worthless while bread becomes more precious than treasure. Hebrew Israelite interpretations of these events emphasize the spiritual roots of physical suffering, arguing that Gaza's crisis reflects deeper covenantal consequences described throughout the Hebrew Bible. They point to passages like Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, where blessings and curses depend on obedience to divine commandments rather than political arrangements. This theological framework offers explanations for why diplomatic solutions repeatedly fail, while human suffering intensifies. Elder Moses Ben Israel, speaking from his community center in Detroit, emphasized that understanding Gaza requires recognizing the covenantal framework that governs all interactions between God and humanity. He argued that political solutions fail because they address symptoms rather than causes, treating human rebellion against divine law as merely political disagreement. His perspective suggests that lasting peace requires repentance and restoration of right relationship with the Creator rather than simply rearranging territorial boundaries or political arrangements. The siege of Gaza mirrors ancient biblical sieges in ways that demand serious theological reflection from anyone who takes prophecy seriously. Jeremiah's account of Jerusalem's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar describes identical conditions: starvation, disease, and desperation that reduce people to shadows of themselves. The prophet's warnings about trusting in fortified cities rather than divine protection seem particularly relevant as both Israelis and Palestinians seek security through a military inspection that might address avoiding the spiritual in the direction inches of conflict. Archaeological evidence from ancient siege sites reveals the psychological as well as physical toll of prolonged isolation and deprivation. Excavations at Lachish show evidence of desperate attempts to preserve life under impossible conditions, including makeshift shelters and hidden food stores that speak to human resilience under extreme pressure. These discoveries remind us that Gaza's current residents participate in an ancient struggle for survival that connects them to countless generations who faced similar ordeals. The Lachish excavations, led by Tel Aviv University, uncovered evidence of the final siege that destroyed the city in 588 BC. Burnt grain stores and skeletal remains tell the story of a population that endured months of deprivation before falling to Babylonian forces. The archaeological record shows attempts to preserve sacred objects and religious texts even as the city faced destruction, indicating that spiritual concerns transcended immediate survival needs. Recent excavations in Gaza itself have uncovered ancient Philistine settlements that faced similar crises during various historical periods. These archaeological layers reveal repeated cycles of siege, destruction, and rebuilding that span millennia. The continuity of settlement in this coastal region demonstrates both the strategic importance of the territory and the resilience of its inhabitants across multiple civilizations and political arrangements. The timing of this crisis carries additional prophetic significance when viewed through Hebrew chronological frameworks. The year 2025 corresponds to significant biblical anniversaries, including sabbatical and jubilee cycles that regulate land ownership and debt forgiveness in Hebrew law. Some scholars calculate that 2025 marks a prophetic watershed, requiring the resolution of territorial disputes according to divine rather than human timelines. Whether these calculations prove accurate remains to be seen, but the convergence of crisis and calendar deserves serious attention from prophecy students. Hebrew chronology experts like Benjamin Goldberg of the Jerusalem Institute has argued for beauty that 25 responds to a sabbatical year in the traditional cycle prescribed in Driven Litection in the scribe year agricultural cycle Leviticus. This cycle mandates rest for the land and forgiveness of debts, principles that could provide frameworks for resolving territorial disputes if applied according to biblical rather than political logic. The coincidence of Gaza's crisis with this chronological marker suggests divine timing rather than mere human planning. The Jubilee cycle, occurring every 50 years according to Leviticus 25, adds another layer of prophetic significance to current timing. Some calculations place 2025 within a Jubilee period requiring the return of ancestral territories and the freeing of captives. Mandates that could transform not only Gaza, but the entire Middle Eastern political landscape if implemented according to divine authority. These chronological frameworks challenge purely secular approaches to conflict resolution by introducing transcendent considerations. The role of biblical covenants in understanding Gaza's crisis cannot be overstated, particularly when viewed through the lens preserved by Hebrew Israelite communities worldwide. The Abrahamic covenant promised blessing to those who blessed Abraham's descendants and cursing to those who cursed them, a principle that applies to treatment of all Israelite tribes, regardless of their current political status. This perspective suggests that Gaza's suffering might reflect covenantal consequences rather than simply the result of political decisions or military strategies. Deuteronomy chapter 28 provides the most comprehensive description of covenantal blessings and curses in the Hebrew Bible, including specific warnings about siege conditions that mirror Gaza's current situation. Verses describing cities under siege, women eating their children, and people reduced to shadows match contemporary reports from Gaza with disturbing accuracy. Hebrew Israelite teachers interpret these passages as warnings about what happens when covenant obligations are forgotten in pursuit of political power or national security. The covenant framework also offers hope for resolution through repentance and restoration rather than military victory or political compromise. Ancient Hebrew law included provisions for debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and the freeing of captives that could provide models for addressing Gaza's crisis. These biblical precedents require all parties to acknowledge their failures and commit to justice, rather than simply pursuing their immediate interest at others' expense. Understanding Gaza through covenantal lenses challenges both Israeli and Palestinian narratives that emphasize historical grievances rather than future responsibilities. The Hebrew Bible consistently calls people to choose blessing over curse, life over death, by accepting divine standards of justice rather than human calculations of advantage. This prophetic perspective suggests that lasting peace requires spiritual transformation rather than simply rearranging political arrangements or redrawing territorial boundaries. The Abrahamic covenant's promise that all nations would be blessed through Abraham's seed creates obligations for how covenant descendants treat other peoples, including their enemies. This principle challenges tribal loyalties that prioritize ethnic solidarity over universal justice. Hebrew Israelite teachers argue that Gaza's crisis tests whether modern Israelis and their supporters understand their covenant, calling to be a light to nations rather than simply an ethnic group pursuing another narrow self-interest. The story of Gedaliah provides a particularly relevant biblical parallel to contemporary Gaza leadership challenges. Appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to govern the Judean remnant after Jerusalem's destruction, Gedaliah attempted to build stability through accommodation with foreign power while maintaining Jewish identity and tradition. His assassination by Jewish extremists who rejected compromise with Babylonian authority led to further exile and suffering for the surviving population. Gedaliah's tragedy illustrates the impossible position of leaders who must navigate between external pressure and internal resistance while their people suffer the consequences of earlier conflicts. His attempt to preserve Jewish life under Babylonian rule required accepting limited sovereignty and foreign oversight, concessions that radical elements rejected as betrayal of national honor. The resulting political chaos drove more Jews into exile and destroyed the fragile stability Gedaliah had tried to create. Contemporary Gaza leaders face similar challenges as they attempt to govern under Israeli occupation while maintaining Palestinian identity and resistance to foreign control. The hostage situation creates additional pressure as leaders must balance demands for military action against occupying forces with concern for civilian safety and captive welfare. Like Gedaliah, they discover that moderation satisfies neither external powers seeking compliance nor internal groups demanding total resistance. The biblical account suggests that Gedaliah's failure resulted from focusing on political survival rather than spiritual renewal, treating symptoms of crisis rather than addressing underlying causes. His accommodation strategy might have succeeded if accompanied by genuine repentance and covenant renewal, but without spiritual foundation, political arrangements proved unstable. This pattern offers sobering lessons for contemporary leaders seeking to resolve conflicts through purely human wisdom rather than divine guidance. Gedaliah's story also warns about the danger of extremist elements within communities that prefer destruction to compromise. The zealots who assassinated him claimed to act from patriotic motives, yet their actions brought greater suffering upon the people they claimed to defend. This pattern repeats throughout history when ideological purity takes precedence over practical concern for human welfare, a dynamic visible in contemporary Middle Eastern politics. Hebrew numerology provides additional insight into the prophetic significance of 2025 as the deadline year for Gaza's crisis resolution. The number 25 represents 5 squared, symbolizing grace multiplied by grace in traditional Jewish interpretation. However, when reduced to its component digits at 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 5 equals 9, the number represents divine completeness and the conclusion of cycles. This mathematical symbolism suggests that 2025 marks the end of one prophetic period and the beginning of another. The Hebrew calendar adds another layer of significance, as 2025 corresponds to specific sabbatical and jubilee calculations that govern land use and debt forgiveness in biblical law. According to some chronological systems, 2025 marks a jubilee year requiring the return of ancestral properties and the freeing of captives, mandates that could transform the entire Middle Eastern political landscape if implemented according to divine rather than human authority. Biblical prophecy repeatedly emphasizes that the divine timing transcends human planning, with events unfolding according to celestial rather than political calendars. The convergence of Gaza's crisis with these chronological markers suggests we may be witnessing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies rather than simply observing contemporary conflicts. Whether world leaders recognize these spiritual dimensions or remain focused on purely political solutions will likely determine whether the crisis leads to resolution or escalation. The prophetic framework also emphasizes that human choices during times of crisis determine whether divine judgment leads to destruction or restoration. The Gaza Ultimatum represents exactly this kind of prophetic moment where decisions made under pressure reveal character and determine destiny for individuals and nations. The Hebrew Israelites' preserved wisdom about navigating such moments becomes invaluable for all who seek to choose blessing over curse in impossible circumstances. Dr. Miriam Cohen, a Hebrew numerology expert at Hebrew University, points out that the year 2025 also corresponds to the Hebrew year 5785, which contains significant numerical patterns. The number 5785 reduces to 25, which further reduces to 7, the number of completion and divine rest. This mathematical convergence suggests that 2025 may mark the completion of prophetic cycles that began with Israel's restoration in 1948, creating expectations for dramatic changes in Middle Eastern politics and religious fulfillment. The psychological dimensions of siege warfare, documented by military historians and biblical scholars alike, provide additional context for understanding Gaza's current crisis. Prolonged isolation and deprivation create collective trauma that affects entire populations for generations, shaping cultural memory and political behavior in ways that transcend immediate circumstances. The Hebrew Bible acknowledges these psychological realities while offering frameworks for healing restoration that address spiritual as well as material needs. Recent studies by Israeli psychologists working with hostage families reveal patterns of anticipatory grief that mirror biblical accounts of exile trauma. Family members report dreams and visions that echo prophetic literature, suggesting that extreme circumstances activate spiritual sensitivities normally dormant in secular environments. These psychological phenomena provide empirical support for Hebrew Israelite claims about the ongoing relevance of prophetic frameworks for understanding contemporary events. The Gaza crisis has also triggered increased interest in prophetic interpretation among previously secular Israelis, with book sales of biblical commentaries rising dramatically since the hostage crisis began. Religious study groups report unprecedented attendance from non-observant Jews seeking to understand current events through traditional frameworks. This spiritual awakening fulfills prophetic predictions about end times revival emerging from extreme circumstances. Despite the overwhelming nature of Gaza's crisis, ancient Hebrew wisdom provides practical as well as spiritual resources for those seeking solutions rooted in divine rather than purely human wisdom. The biblical emphasis on justice, mercy, and humility offers frameworks for addressing root causes of conflict rather than simply managing symptoms. These principles require all parties to acknowledge their failures and commit to transformation rather than simply pursuing victory over opponents. Spiritual resilience becomes essential for those who would serve as peacemakers during times of crisis and conflict. The Hebrew Bible consistently emphasizes that lasting solutions emerge from relationship with the divine rather than purely human effort or political arrangement. This perspective encourages prayer, study, and community building as essential foundations for any attempt to address systemic problems like those manifested in Gaza's current situation. Hebrew Israeli communities worldwide demonstrate practical models maintaining identity and community under difficult circumstances while working for justice and reconciliation. The emphasis on education, mutual support, and spiritual discipline provides examples of how ancient wisdom can be applied to contemporary challenges. These communities often bridge different ethnic and cultural groups through shared commitment to biblical values rather than narrow ethnic or political identity. The International Hebrew Israelite Peace Initiative, based in Jerusalem with chapters in major cities worldwide, has organized prayer vigils and humanitarian aid efforts that transcend traditional religious and ethnic boundaries. Their work demonstrates how prophetic interpretation can inspire practical action rather than passive speculation. Community leaders report that crisis creates opportunities for spiritual growth and cross-cultural understanding that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The crisis also calls for practical action, including support for humanitarian aid organizations working to relieve suffering regardless of political affiliation. Organizations like the International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, and various faith-based relief agencies provide channels for expressing compassion through concrete action rather than simply offering prayers or political commentary. Such engagement demonstrates the biblical principle that faith must be accompanied by works to be effective. Médecins Sans Frontières reports from Gaza describe medical conditions that require both immediate intervention and long-term commitment to rebuilding healthcare infrastructure. Their medical teams document cases of malnutrition-related blindness in children, conditions that could be prevented with adequate nutrition but may cause permanent disability without immediate treatment. These medical realities transform abstract political debates into urgent humanitarian imperatives that demand immediate response. The global community's response to Gaza's crisis will likely determine whether the situation leads to broader regional conflict or becomes a catalyst for genuine peace based on justice rather than simply the absence of war. International law provides frameworks for protecting civilian populations and ensuring humanitarian access. But implementation requires political will that transcends narrow national interests. The Hebrew prophetic tradition consistently emphasizes that nations face divine judgment based on their treatment of the vulnerable and oppressed. European Union foreign ministers have called for immediate humanitarian corridors and international oversight of aid distribution, proposals that Israel has rejected as threats to national security. This standoff illustrates the broader tension between humanitarian principles and security concerns that characterizes most contemporary conflicts. The Hebrew Bible offers frameworks for balancing these competing claims through emphasis on justice that protects both the vulnerable and the community as a whole. Contemporary Christians and Jews who take biblical prophecy seriously must grapple with Gaza's crisis as a test of their commitment to justice and mercy, rather than simply support Latin or nationalic with their ethnic and ethnicizing positioning whatever political national identity. The Hebrew Bible consistently challenges God's people to choose righteousness over tribal loyalty when the two conflict, a principle that applies to all who claim biblical authority for their political positions. The National Council of Churches has issued statements calling for immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access, positions that some Christian Zionist groups reject as undermining Israel's security needs. This theological divide reflects deeper questions about how biblical prophecy should inform contemporary political engagement. Hebrew Israelite perspectives offer third-way approaches that affirm Israel's covenant calling while demanding justice for all peoples affected by Middle Eastern conflicts. The awakening of global consciousness about Gaza's crisis represents an opportunity for spiritual as well as political transformation if approached with wisdom, rather than simply emotional reaction or political and humanitarian calculation. The Hebrew Israelites preserved knowledge about navigating persecution and exile while maintaining hope for restoration offers valuable guidance for all who seek to respond faithfully to contemporary challenges. Social media campaigns using hashtags like #GazaCrisis and #Hostage have generated millions of posts worldwide, creating unprecedented global awareness of the situation. However, much of this digital engagement remains at the level of emotional expression rather than sustained action. Hebrew Israelite leaders emphasize the need for deeper engagement that includes study of biblical frameworks and commitment to long-term justice rather than simply viral sympathy. Educational initiatives that help people understand both the historical and prophetic dimensions of Middle Eastern conflicts can contribute to more informed and compassionate than on media coverage or political propaganda, or those based purely on propaganda. The Hebrew Union College has developed curriculum connecting biblical text about exile and restoration with contemporary refugee experiences worldwide, creating educational frameworks that avoid partisan political interpretation while fostering compassion and understanding. These educational approaches demonstrate how ancient wisdom can inform modern engagement without predetermined political conclusions. The integration of ancient wisdom with contemporary action requires careful attention to both spiritual principles and practical constraints. Biblical commands to love enemies and seek justice must be balanced with realistic assessment of what individuals and communities can accomplish given their resources and circumstances. This integration challenges both religious communities that emphasize prayer without action and secular groups that pursue political goals without spiritual foundation. Hebrew Israelite perspectives on Gaza emphasize the importance seeing contemporary events within the broader context of divine purpose and prophetic fulfillment, rather than simply as isolated political crises. This framework encourages hope even in desperate situations, while demanding concrete action to relieve suffering and address injustice. Community organizing around Gaza's crisis provides opportunities to build coalitions that transcend traditional ethnic and political boundaries through shared commitment to human dignity and justice. Such coalitions demonstrate the prophetic vision of nations learning war, no more through practical collaboration on immediate challenges. The Hebrew Bible's emphasis on welcoming strangers and protecting the vulnerable creates common ground for people of different backgrounds to work together. The Chicago Interfaith Coalition for Gaza Relief includes synagogues, churches, mosques, and Hindu temples working together to provide humanitarian aid and advocate for peaceful resolution of the crisis. Their collaboration demonstrates how shared concern for human suffering can bridge religious and ethnic differences that normally create division. Coalition leaders report that crisis creates opportunities for relationships that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The role of media and technology in shaping public understanding of Gaza's crisis cannot be ignored by those seeking to respond faithfully to contemporary challenges. Social media platforms, news organizations, and digital communications shape public opinion in ways that can either promote understanding or increase polarization. Hebrew Israelite communities' experience with preserving truth through oral tradition and community networks offers valuable lessons about maintaining authentic communication in information-saturated environments. Digital platforms have enabled unprecedented global access to real-time information about Gaza's conditions, including first-hand accounts from residents and aid workers, bypass traditional media gatekeepers. However, this same technology enables the spread of misinformation and propaganda that can inflame tensions rather than promoting understanding. Hebrew Israelite elders emphasize the importance of discernment and community verification of information rather than accepting digital claims at face value. prayer, and spiritual discipline provide essential resources for sustaining long-term engagement with seemingly intractable problems like Gaza's crisis without becoming overwhelmed by despair or hardened by cynicism. The biblical emphasis on Sabbath rest, communal worship, and regular study creates rhythms that support sustained action while preventing burnout. These spiritual practices recognize that ultimate solutions depend on divine rather than purely human initiative. The Temple Mount Prayer Initiative, organized by Hebrew Israelite communities in Jerusalem, holds weekly interfaith prayer services for peace in Gaza and the return of hostages. Participants report that regular prayer discipline helps maintain hope and compassion despite overwhelming circumstances. These spiritual practices demonstrate how ancient religious traditions can provide contemporary resources for sustaining engagement with difficult situations. The prophetic call to choose life over death, blessing over curse, becomes concrete through daily decisions about how to respond to news about Gaza's crisis and similar situations worldwide. Every choice to seek understanding rather than simply confirming existing biases, to support practical relief efforts rather than just expressing opinions, to build relationships across difference rather than retreating into tribal identity participates in the broader work of choosing blessing over curse that defines biblical faithfulness. The Hebrew Israelite Academy in Brooklyn has developed curriculum that helps young people understand connections between biblical prophecy and contemporary events while fostering commitment to justice and reconciliation. Students study ancient texts alongside current news reports, learning to apply prophetic principles to practical situations. This educational approach demonstrates how traditional religious education can engage contemporary challenges rather than remaining isolated from current events. International diplomatic efforts to resolve Gaza's crisis have foundered repeatedly on the fundamental problem of competing narratives about justice, security, and historical responsibility. The Hamas leadership demands complete Israeli withdrawal and the lifting of all blockades as preconditions for hostage release, while Israeli officials insist that security guarantees must precede any territorial concessions. This stalemate illustrates the limitations of purely political approaches to conflicts rooted in deeper spiritual and historical grievances. Egyptian mediators have proposed various compromise arrangements involving phased prisoner releases, temporary ceasefires, and international oversight of aid distribution. However, these proposals fail to address the underlying issues of territorial control, resource access, and political representation that created the crisis. Hebrew Israelite analysts argue that lasting solutions require acknowledgement of covenant principles and divine justice rather than simply dividing disputed resources or territory. The European Union has offered to provide peacekeeping forces and reconstruction aid if both parties accept comprehensive ceasefire arrangements. But this proposal faces resistance from hardliners on both sides who reject external intervention. The biblical precedent of foreign powers serving as mediators in Israeli disputes provides some hope for international involvement, though success depends on all parties recognizing divine rather than purely human authority in conflict resolution. As we approach the September 15th deadline for Israel's Gaza ultimatum, the international community faces choices that will determine whether this crisis escalates into broader regional war or becomes a catalyst for deeper peace, based on justice rather than simply the absence of conflict. The Hebrew prophetic tradition provides frameworks for understanding these choices as tests of character rather than merely strategic decisions, with consequences extending far beyond immediate participants. Recent intelligence reports suggest that Iran and its regional allies are preparing for possible military intervention if Israel proceeds with complete Gaza occupation, raising the specter of multi-frontal war that could engulf the entire Middle East. These developments fulfill prophetic warnings about conflicts that begin with local disputes but expand to involve all nations, testing whether humanity has learned to choose peace over war through justice rather than victory. The hostage families continue their desperate vigil, caught between hope for diplomatic breakthrough and fear that time is running out for their loved ones. Their anguish represents the human cost of political calculations and strategic planning, reminding all parties that abstract principles must be balanced with concrete concern for individual suffering. The biblical emphasis on redeeming captives provides moral imperative that transcends political convenience or military strategy. As we conclude this comprehensive examination of Gaza's crisis through the lens of Hebrew Israelite wisdom and biblical prophecy, the urgency of our moment becomes undeniably clear. We stand at a prophetic crossroads where ancient warnings meet contemporary realities in ways that demand both spiritual discernment and practical action from all who claim faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The chambers beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount continue yielding secrets that illuminate both past and future, while Gaza's suffering fulfills prophetic warnings with terrifying precision. The Hebrew Israelites' preserved wisdom about navigating persecution while maintaining hope for restoration provides essential guidance for all who seek to respond faithfully to the challenges of our time. Their understanding of covenantal relationship offers frameworks for addressing root causes of conflict, rather than simply managing symptoms. I urge each of you to engage deeply with the biblical texts we have examined, particularly Deuteronomy's descriptions of blessings and curses, Jeremiah's accounts of siege and exile, and the prophetic visions of restoration found throughout Hebrew Scripture. Study these passages alongside contemporary reports from Gaza and similar crisis zones, seeking to understand how ancient warnings apply to present circumstances while avoiding the temptation to use prophecy simply to confirm existing political positions. Join Hebrew Israelite study groups and interfaith dialogue initiatives that work to bridge different communities through shared commitment to justice and reconciliation rather than narrow ethnic or religious identity. Support humanitarian organizations providing practical relief to Gaza's suffering population regardless of political affiliation, demonstrating that faith must be accompanied by works to be credible. Engage in prayer and spiritual discipline that sustains long-term commitment to peace and justice without becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of contemporary challenges. Subscribe to this channel for continued coverage of prophetic developments in the Middle East and their connection to Hebrew Israelite wisdom preserved through centuries of exile and persecution. Share this content with others who seek to understand contemporary events through biblical lenses rather than purely political analysis. Comment with your own insights about how ancient prophecy illuminates current crises and what practical steps you are taking to respond faithfully. Most importantly, remember that we are not merely observers of prophetic fulfillment but participants in the unfolding drama of divine purpose in human history. The choices we make about how to respond to Gaza's crisis and similar situations will determine whether we contribute to blessing or curse, life or death, in the great spiritual struggle that defines our time. The Hebrew Israelites have shown us that maintaining faith and identity through the darkest circumstances prepares communities to participate in divine restoration when the time comes. The ancient covenant promises remain in effect, are offering hope for all who choose faithfulness over convenience, justice over tribal loyalty, and divine wisdom over purely human calculation. Gaza's crisis tests whether contemporary believers will demonstrate the same resilience and faithfulness that enabled the Hebrew Israelites to preserve divine truth through centuries of persecution and displacement. The answer to that test will determine not only our individual destiny, but the trajectory of human history as ancient prophecies reach their appointed fulfillment. What role will you play in this unfolding prophetic drama? Will you stand with those who choose blessing over curse, life over death, through concrete actions that demonstrate faith in the God who scattered and will regather the tribes of Israel? The time for decision grows shorter with each passing day, but the opportunity for faithful response remains available to all who have eyes to see and hearts to understand the signs of our prophetic moment. The September 15th deadline approaches with each sunset, carrying weight that extends far beyond the immediate fate of 53 hostages or the territorial control of a small coastal territory. This deadline represents a prophetic moment when ancient warnings about choosing life or death, blessing or curse, become concrete reality rather than abstract theology. The Hebrew Israelites' preserved wisdom about navigating such moments becomes invaluable for all who seek to choose faithfully in the face of impossible circumstances.